Opening the center immediately. This pawn establishes a claim for space and prepares for active piece development. Mirroring white's central occupation immediately contests the critical d4 square, preparing for piece development and a battle for initiative. Developing a knight to control the center and prepare for castling is a fundamental opening principle, efficiently opening lines for future piece activity. Developing a knight to its natural square reinforces the central pawn and prepares for queenside expansion, instantly seizing the initiative. This bishop aims to disrupt black's central pawn structure and potentially create attacking opportunities. Striking at the center and developing a knight, black boldly contests white's aggressive bishop, creating immediate tension and a sharp battle for central space. Securing the king's safety now frees white to focus on central expansion and piece activity. Boldly seizing the central pawn, black initiates a sharp tactical confrontation and opens lines for immediate counterplay. Unleashing central pressure, white immediately challenges black's central pawn and opens lines for further development, aiming to seize initiative and restrict black's pieces. Repositioning the knight here aims to solidify the pawn structure and contest central influence. A subtle but vital defensive maneuver. Suddenly, the pawn structure is fractured, creating doubled pawns for black and potentially opening diagonals for your bishop to exploit later. This exchange, while seemingly a simple capture, fundamentally alters the positional landscape. You've sacrificed the bishop pair but gained a structural advantage that could prove decisive if black cannot adequately address the weaknesses. Consider the pressure you can now exert on the d-file. Accepting the doubled pawns fundamentally alters black's pawn structure, creating permanent weaknesses on the queenside while gifting white a central pawn majority and an open d-file for future incursions. Liberating the e-pawn now opens lines, threatening to regain material while creating dynamic imbalances, though it might temporarily weaken the pawn structure's central integrity as the minor piece activity becomes paramount. Recapturing the pawn with the knight repositions the piece to a more active square, preparing to contest the center and potentially white's weakened kingside pawns. Demanding an immediate queen exchange simplifies the position dramatically, entering an endgame where white aims to exploit black's compromised pawn structure and potentially isolated pieces. The monarch must now navigate the liberated central files, a precarious path with doubled pawns on the c-file potentially hindering piece mobility. This repositioning, though forced, creates opportunities for white to exploit black's slightly fragmented pawn structure. The king's safety is paramount, and its active involvement early in the endgame demands careful calculation of pawn breaks and tempo. Developing a knight to support the central pawn offers improved piece activity and prepares for a potential kingside castling advantage, though the unusual pawn structure necessitates careful maneuvering. Gaining a bit of breathing room for your king. This pawn advance aims to prevent an immediate bishop development towards the kingside. A subtle but important territorial claim. Solidifying the kingside pawn structure. This move aims to prevent any immediate black knight infiltration or bishop diagonals towards the king's sanctuary. It's a prudent step to ensure the king remains absolutely secure as the game ventures into this peculiar endgame. Developing the bishop to this square initiates a subtle re-equilibrium, preparing for potential pawn breaks in the center and contesting the control of the dark squares that white's queen initially dominated. Solidifying queenside presence now. This maneuver aims to prepare a swift development for the light-squared bishop, seeking to activate it on either b2 or a3 to contest black's already established bishop on d7 and pressure that d6 pawn. Shifting the monarch is a priority after the pawn grab, aiming to tuck away the king on a more secure diagonal and begin developing the remaining pieces toward the center. Reactivating the bishop to c3's diagonal. This repositioning offers a more active presence, eyeing the kingside potential and reinforcing the central pawn structure against any immediate kingside advances black might consider. Strategically solidifying the queenside pawn structure. Black's advance of the b-pawn prepares to develop the light-squared bishop to a more active diagonal, potentially targeting white's central pawns and offering greater counterplay in the ensuing middle game. Preparing to seize the central open file. The rook slides into place, setting the stage for potential pressure along the d-file and aiming to restrict black's pieces from this crucial pathway. The knight's journey to e7, while seemingly a retreat after the earlier pawn push, is a crucial step in regrouping black's pieces, aiming to challenge white's central pawns and potentially activate the bishop on d7 by clearing the path for a later c5 advance, all while keeping a watchful eye on the now exposed king. Relocating the rook to the second rank prepares to contest the d-file more effectively and offers a dual purpose, either supporting a central pawn advance or creating an escape square for the king should the center become too volatile, while simultaneously unburdening the first rank for potential piece repositioning. Black boldly challenges the central pawn structure, aiming to break white's spatial advantage and open lines for active piece play, though it concedes some king safety and potentially creates pawn weaknesses later. Consolidating control of the d-file now aims to pressure black's weakened pawn structure and hinder any attempts at counterplay, forcing further defensive maneuvers. Centralizing the bishop to e6 now addresses the awkwardness of its previous diagonal and prepares for greater influence on the light squares. This development injects new life into black's position, aiming to counter white's queenside pressure and potentially offer a more dynamic game than merely defending passive weaknesses. Shifting the knight to e2 aims to activate it in a more central role, potentially supporting a kingside attack or reinforcing the d4 pawn, while also creating a pathway for the other knight to reach a more aggressive square. Pushing the g-pawn opens up the kingside, aiming to gain space and potentially create attacking chances. But it also creates a pawn weakness on h6 that could become a target later. Unleashing a pawn storm. White bravely challenges the dark-squared bishop's influence and seeks to fracture black's pawn structure on the kingside, creating dynamic imbalances for the middle game. Boldly confronting the central tension. This pawn advances to challenge the knight and create immediate spatial pressure, aiming to dislodge the strong white outpost and potentially open lines for counterplay. Sensing the king's potential exposure, white rechannels the knight to a safer outpost, preparing to bolster the kingside pawn structure and potentially create an escape square for the monarch should black's queenside pressure escalate. Black's intention is to secure the advanced knight on f5, but this pawn push risks creating permanent weaknesses around the king, potentially sacrificing dynamic counterplay for a static pawn chain that might prove cumbersome later. Unleashing the rook, white forcefully targets the weakened kingside dark squares and aims to disrupt black's developing pieces with a devastating check. Relinquishing the active rook from the d-file, black's monarch ventures into the open, seeking refuge from the looming queen's assault. However, this positional retreat arguably exacerbates its isolation, leaving it more vulnerable to future attacks as white's pieces continue to coordinate with menacing intent. A timely rook lift seizes the open file, aiming to exploit the exposed black king and create pressure on the queenside. The black king, now exposed and out in the open after that rook sacrifice, must actively participate in defensive duties. A stark contrast to its cozy position just a few moves ago. Unleashing the rook along the now opened 8th rank, white forces the black king to a precarious square, setting up potential disruptions to black's slightly awkward pawn structure. Black's king, now precariously exposed on the 7th rank, faces immediate annihilation as white's rook surges forward, aiming to deliver a decisive blow. Sensing the open h-file, white maneuvers the knight towards potential kingside pressure and a more active central presence, aiming to solidify the pawn majority and perhaps launch a future pawn storm. The knight's journey to g6 aims to reinforce the kingside pawn structure and prepare for a potential regrouping, although it relinquishes the active kingside defense. Opening up the kingside pawn structure, white intends to challenge black's imposing central pawn mass and create potential attacking avenues for their pieces. Black's pawn advances. A pawn storm now seeks to disrupt white's queenside structure by challenging the c4 square, potentially opening lines for attack or creating space for maneuver. Seizing the open file with this pawn thrust immediately aims to exploit the compromised queenside structure, creating a dynamic imbalance where black's doubled pawns on the c-file become a significant liability if white can properly coordinate their pieces. Capturing the knight on f4 is a double-edged sword, immediately opening the g-file towards white's uncastled king while simultaneously offering black a central pawn majority. The pawn on e5 now becomes a significant target, and black's knight on g6, while currently passive, might find active squares if white isn't careful with their pawn structure. Opening the g-file with this capture dramatically alters the pawn structure, creating an isolated pawn for black on f4 while simultaneously giving white control over a key open file that can be exploited for future attacks. Unleashing a pawn storm forward, black disrupts white's pawn shield and aims to inject chaos into the center. A desperate gamble to exploit the open lines and potential king exposure. Reactivating the knight to patrol the crucial central squares and prepare a potential advance along the kingside is a sensible idea after the aggressive, yet potentially risky, pawn push. A desperate attempt to create counterplay by sacrificing a piece, aiming to open lines and disrupt white's pawn structure before the inevitable endgame. Protecting the monarch from the looming knight and pawn threat becomes paramount, solidifying the king's position in the face of black's aggressive pawn storm. Now that the open files have been cleared, black seizes the initiative, challenging white's central pawn structure and simultaneously creating a strong outpost for the bishop on c4, eyeing potential disruptions along the diagonal.